Hi, I'm Darian. 12 years ago, my father told me to get out, said I was trash because his new wife didn't want me around. I stood there, 23, with nothing but a wallet my grandfather left me and the echo of a slammed door. They never called, not once, not when I was homeless, not when I buried my best friend, not when I built everything from scratch. And yesterday, they showed up in torn coats at my penthouse, saying, "We're moving in. You want to know what I said? No. You need to hear what I did, because some families don't just abandon you. They try to come back when they think you're finally worth something. But what if the door they slammed is one they can never open again?" I parked across the street and sat longer than I needed to. The engine made that soft ticking sound it always does after a long drive, like it was settling its own nerves. I left my hands on the steering wheel, fingers loose but steady, giving myself a moment to breathe before stepping out. The house hadn't changed. Same pale siding, same narrow porch with the railing I fixed years back after a storm tore part of it loose. I remembered sanding those boards late into the night, my palms burning, my grandfather sitting nearby in a lawn chair telling me I didn't owe anyone proof of my worth. No one ever thanked me for that repair. I didn't expect them to. I wasn't there for money. I kept telling myself that. I wasn't there for approval either. I just wanted the door closed cleanly instead of left hanging the way it had been my whole life. My brother's truck sat in the driveway, black and immaculate, like it had never known a dirt road. Chrome wheels caught the afternoon light. He'd bought it recently. I knew because he posted everything. New truck, new watch, new title at work. Proof that he'd been chosen. I crossed the lawn, every step measured. I'd learned early how to move through this house without drawing attention. Inside, voices drifted from the living room. Not warm voices, polite ones, the kind that slide past you instead of toward you. My mother stood near the couch, smiling wide as she wrapped both arms around my brother. She laughed at something he said, a soft sound she rarely used anymore. When she noticed me, the smile paused. She gave a small nod. Then she turned back to him. My father stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring outside as if the view mattered. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew I was there. I took the chair at the end of the table, not offered, just available. The lawyer sat across from me, briefcase open, papers stacked with care. He gave a professional smile. Neutral, alert. The reading began. Accounts, properties, numbers delivered in a calm, practiced voice. As each asset was named, my parents leaned forward a little more. My father's shoulders loosened. My mother clasped her hands together like she was holding a prayer. When the final figure was read out loud, the room broke. 16.9 million. My father laughed, not a chuckle. A full laugh, sharp and pleased. My mother joined him. My brother nodded like this had been decided years ago. "Our boy earned it," my father said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A couple of approving murmurs followed. Someone clapped once. My brother smiled, gracious, like he was accepting an award instead of a lifetime of favoritism. I stayed still. I kept my face calm. Inside, something folded in on itself. The lawyer shifted in his chair. He glanced at his papers, then reached beneath the table. My father moved first. He pulled out an old wallet and placed it in front of me. Brown leather, cracked, torn along the edges. It looked lighter than it should have been, like it had already given up. "That's more your speed," my mother said, her voice casual, almost kind. My father leaned back. His eyes finally met mine. "Not every child is a blessing." The words didn't echo. They landed clean. Simple. Finished. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what he meant. I picked up the wallet. Inside were 3 wrinkled bills and a small piece of faded paper tucked behind them. I couldn't make out the writing. No one watched me closely. There was no anger in the room. Just dismissal. The kind that says, "You've already been written out." I slipped the wallet into my jacket pocket. The lawyer hadn't taken his eyes off it. Not my face. The wallet. His brow tightened, just slightly, like something didn't fit where it had been placed. The room grew quiet again. Heavy. Like everyone was waiting for the moment to end so they could move on without me. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Before we finalize today's reading," he said carefully, "there is one more item your grandfather insisted be read." He paused. "And it concerns Darian." No one spoke. The silence wasn't just silence. It was loaded, heavy with old resentments and unspoken rules. You could feel it shift the air, like something thick settling in your chest. I sat there, still, not moving a muscle, not even blinking, while all eyes bounced around the room, trying not to land on me. Clive hadn't even finished his sentence before my brother stepped forward. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. It was like his feet knew what to do before his brain did. He slid between the lawyer and me, like a door slamming shut that I hadn't even tried to walk through yet. "Clive," he said, casual but firm, "I'm sure there's been a mix-up. Grandpa was not himself at the end. We all know that." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I'd seen that move before, not just from him, but from all of them. Shut it down. Redirect. Keep the story clean. My dad joined him, hands still in his pockets, like he wasn't ruffled in the slightest. "Let's not drag this out," he said. "What's done is done. There's no need to complicate things with whatever this is." "This is a formality," my mother added quickly, her voice tight at the edges. "I'm sure your father didn't mean to exclude us from any last-minute notes. Maybe it was a draft." They weren't talking to me. They were talking over me, around me, like I was a stranger in a room full of people who all knew the lines to a script I'd never seen. And I'd been through this exact scene too many times to count. Same players, same moves. I could have stood up. I could have raised my voice, demanded they sit down and listen. But I didn't. I did the only thing I knew how to do around them. I paid attention. Clive cleared his throat again, firmer this time. "With all due respect, Mr. Hale," he said, turning to my father, "your father gave me this envelope personally, 2 months before he passed. He instructed, very clearly, that it be opened in your presence, and that Darian be present to hear it. His words, not mine." That got their attention. My mother's hand, which had been fiddling with her necklace, stopped midair. Sterling let out a low chuckle, but it didn't sound right. "Come on, you're saying he... what? Snuck around? Made some secret plan?" He shook his head like he was trying to shake something off. He was old, Clive, confused. But his voice wasn't smooth anymore. Something cracked underneath. He was trying to laugh it off, but I saw it. The twitch in his jaw, the way he glanced at our dad for backup. He wasn't just irritated. He was rattled. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't some weird, sentimental side note from a dying man. This was something they didn't want read, not because it didn't matter, because it did. Clive reached into his folder and slowly pulled out the envelope. It was pale yellow, thick paper, sealed tight. My name was written across the front in bold block letters, the kind Grandpa always used, even on Christmas tags. He always wrote in uppercase like he wanted his words to be permanent. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew that handwriting. My mother's breath hitched. My father's jaw tightened. Nobody spoke. Sterling stepped forward again. All right. Look, we're not trying to hide anything here. His hand reached toward the envelope, fingers just grazing the edge of it. Just give it here. I'll read it aloud myself. Keep it fair. Clive didn't flinch. That's not what your father asked. I stood up slowly. I'm not here to take anything, I said. My voice didn't rise. I didn't puff my chest. I just stood there, even. I just want to hear what he left for me. That landed. Even Clive glanced at me like he wasn't expecting that. The room didn't get quieter. It was already dead quiet. But the energy shifted. I wasn't begging. I wasn't challenging. I was just asking to be heard. Sterling looked at me, long and hard, then back at the envelope. Finally, he let go. Whatever, he muttered, stepping back. But before he turned away, he leaned in, voice just above a whisper. You're not walking out of here with anything that changes my future. He didn't need to shout. That was the kind of threat that doesn't care if anyone hears it. Clive adjusted the envelope in his hand, carefully now, like it weighed more than it did. My mother's voice cracked through the quiet. Douglas, she said sharply, eyes locked on my father. Tell him what you did, before it's too late. For a long beat, my father didn't respond. He stood still, hand resting on the back of a dining chair, his eyes trained on a spot in the carpet like he was reading something only he could see. My mother stayed where she was, arms crossed. Her weight shifted onto one hip in that way she always used when she felt cornered but didn't want to show it. No one in the room made a sound. I watched the way my dad's jaw moved, tightening, loosening. He was working through something in his head. That much was clear. But this wasn't confusion. It was calculation. He wasn't surprised by the envelope. He was trying to decide whether to admit to something or deny it altogether. He didn't look at me, not once. I knew then that whatever this was, it hadn't been an accident, not a clerical error or some forgotten piece of paperwork. It was something he'd done, willfully, quietly. And now it was coming up for air. The room started to feel smaller, heavier, like the walls were leaning in. I remembered standing in that same spot when I was 17, after a football game I didn't even want to play in, being told I should have done better, because that's what winners do. I remembered how they barely noticed when I quit the team 2 weeks later. No one asked why. No one cared. All those moments started surfacing, being left out of family meetings, having chores assigned that never got acknowledged, being given less, expected to do more. I'd chalked it up to being the quiet kid, the different one. But now I could see the pattern for what it was. It wasn't that I'd been forgotten. I'd been removed, deliberately. Clive broke the tension. There are 2 documents, he said, lifting the flap of the envelope slowly. One is a letter. The other is a codicil, an amendment your grandfather added to the will. My father's head snapped up at the word codicil. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. This isn't just a sentimental message, Clive continued, firm but professional. It has legal weight, and it must be read aloud. He unfolded the letter first. I watched his hands as he smoothed the paper. His movements were deliberate, respectful, like he understood the gravity of what was in his grasp. Then he began to read. My dearest Darian, Clive said, the room still dead quiet. If you're hearing this, it means I've already gone, and knowing this family, I had no choice but to write this down and make sure it reached you. Myself. It was his voice I heard, not Clive's, clear as day in my mind. You have always been the one who saw things clearly, even when it hurt. You were the one who asked questions no one wanted to answer. And because of that, they made you pay for it. My father's eyes closed briefly. My mother's hand dropped to her side, limp. You were never weak. They just wanted you to feel like you were. You didn't fall short. They pushed you aside. That wasn't neglect. That was strategy. Every word hit like a match striking. And while they built their walls and locked their doors, I watched. I saw the weight you carried. And I want you to know, you were never invisible to me. Something shifted in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't clench my fists. But a stillness settled in me, deep and warm, like someone finally turned on a light in a room I'd been sitting in my whole life. I glanced at my brother. He wasn't grinning anymore. His mouth was pressed tight. His eyes fixed on the letter like he could will it to vanish if he stared hard enough. Clive kept going. I've made arrangements, different ones than what your father intended. If this letter is being read, then the time has come to set some things right. He stopped. No one moved. My parents were pale. Not the embarrassed kind of pale. This was the kind that comes when you see control slipping through your fingers and realize you can't stop it. I stayed seated. I didn't speak. But my heart was thudding with something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. My pain had been real. It had been orchestrated, and someone had seen it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just enduring. I was witnessing the moment things began to shift. Clive folded the letter and placed it on the table, then reached into the envelope again. There's more, he said. A change to the will dated 3 weeks before Mr. Hale's passing. He signed it in the presence of 2 witnesses. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. I could feel the air change again. That thick tension returned, sharp and clinging. My father's eyes narrowed. My brother stepped closer to the table. You don't have to do this, my mother said suddenly, her voice too calm. It'll only make things worse. Clive looked at her, unflinching. It's already been filed. Today's reading was meant to include it. He paused, scanning the faces around the room before continuing. This letter, he said carefully, was written after your father made changes your grandfather never approved. The silence that followed Clive's words wasn't passive. It pressed down like humidity before a storm. My father didn't flinch, but I saw it in his posture. His back straightened too fast, like he needed to hold something together. My mother glanced at him, sharp and expectant. My brother, he looked at the door like maybe, just maybe, walking out was still an option. But he stayed. We all did. Clive didn't raise his voice, didn't change his tone. That made it worse. When Mr. Hale's health began to decline, Clive continued, his gaze steady on my father, certain documents were revised without his full capacity or consent. These changes were submitted through internal channels, but they were not authorized by the original grantor. He paused just enough to let that land. No one interrupted. I watched my father's face. He was calculating again, lips tight, eyes still. His hands folded in front of him on the table like he was a judge at a hearing, not the man under question. But the room had already shifted. My whole life, he'd spoken like someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him, but expected them to crush everyone else. His kind of control was quiet, administrative, polite, on the surface. That was always his trick. Turn injustice into procedure. This wasn't theft, he said finally, tone measured, deliberate. It was practical. I was trying to protect the estate, keep things clean. Your grandfather wasn't in a position to manage things clearly, and I stepped in. For the family. For the family, I repeated under my breath, a phrase he used often, rarely about people. He turned to me then, not with apology, not even embarrassment, just that cool managerial concern he used when I was younger and asked for anything beyond bare minimum. You know what these kinds of transitions are like, he added, legal messes, emotional chaos. I took care of what needed taking care of. My brother nodded, too eagerly. He didn't even touch the money, Darian. It was more about structure. You know how Grandpa could get in his later months. I didn't answer. Not because I agreed, but because something new had taken root in me. I wanted them to keep talking. I wanted to watch the shape of this thing reveal itself. Clive didn't let the defense hang too long. There's something important to clarify, he said, folding his hands gently on the folder in front of him. This letter wasn't just a side note. It was a direct response to those changes. Your grandfather anticipated resistance and addressed it explicitly. He let that hang and then added, in writing. The word writing might as well have been a gavel. Intent, Clive said, matters more than process, especially when a power shift takes place in silence. My mother's face was stiff. Her jaw twitched slightly. Her fingers pressed together tightly in her lap, white at the knuckles. She whispered something, toward my father, too low for me to catch. I leaned back in my chair. I wasn't triumphant and I wasn't angry, but I was clear. For once, I wasn't the one trying to prove something. The truth was doing it on its own. Clive turned to me, just slightly. Mr. Hale made sure these documents couldn't be misfiled, edited, or discarded. They were notarized, witnessed, and secured with instructions to be read exactly under these conditions. I nodded once. I didn't need to say anything. The authority that had always lived with my father, unquestioned, permanent, was starting to shake, not from force, from exposure, and he knew it. My brother tried to laugh, but it came out forced, like it belonged to someone else. Okay, come on. You're making it sound like some conspiracy. Dad's been the one keeping this house from falling apart. Grandpa would have ended up scammed or bankrupt if someone hadn't stepped in. Clive raised an eyebrow. That's an opinion. This, he tapped the letter, is a directive. My brother's smirk collapsed halfway through forming. I could see it now. He didn't have a backup plan. For years, he'd walked through doors someone else had unlocked for him, and suddenly, they weren't opening. I didn't gloat. I just watched. This wasn't about who deserved what, Clive said calmly. It was about what Mr. Hale wanted, and he made himself very clear. I looked around the room, same furniture, same rug from my childhood, same family photos on the mantel, none of them featuring me past age 15. But the atmosphere had shifted. The hierarchy that ruled this house was off balance, and no one was pretending it wasn't. Clive reached into the folder again and pulled out another document, thicker, more formal. This is the attachment mentioned in the letter, he said. It outlines what Mr. Hale intended to be enforced should any unauthorized changes come into play. My father sat back, arms crossed. My mother muttered, "This is ridiculous." But she didn't leave. Your grandfather, Clive continued, holding the document with care, left instructions for what should happen if those changes were ever questioned. The light in the room was different now, softer, angled, Late-day sun filtered through the curtains and landed across the table like a quiet reminder that time was still moving, even when the people in the room were frozen. Clive's words had dropped like a pin into a still lake. No one spoke, but the ripples were obvious. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in him, tight muscles in his jaw, shoulders drawn in ever so slightly. It was the same body language he used when I brought home a report card that wasn't perfect, or when I asked to borrow the car, or when I told him I wanted to study something other than business. The message was always the same: disappointment cloaked in silence. Now it was the weight of consequence cloaked in stillness. I became aware of my own breath, the way I was gripping the edge of my seat, my fingers numb, my chest tight, not from fear, but from the slow, steady pressure of everything unsaid, suddenly sitting at the table beside us. My eyes drifted to the window. The oak tree in the yard, the one I'd fallen out of when I was 10, had barely changed. It was strange how everything around this house seemed stuck in time, except me. "You okay?" Clive's voice was quiet, almost casual, but he wasn't asking out of politeness. He was watching me, really watching, and I knew it. I gave him a small nod. It wasn't a lie, not quite the truth either. Truth was, I wasn't sure. Because in that moment, something broke open inside me. Not loudly, quietly. A slow collapse of the walls I'd spent years building just to survive in this family. I could feel the weight of every memory they had chosen not to share, every holiday I'd spent alone, every conversation I was left out of, every laugh I was never invited into. It all came rushing back, sharp and unfiltered. What was the point of reopening old wounds? Did I really need to hear more? My chest ached with a feeling I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Exhaustion. Not physical. Deeper than that. Soul tired. The cost of the truth was starting to feel too high. Across from me, my mother shifted in her chair. She wasn't looking at Clive anymore. Her eyes were on me. And they weren't pleading. They weren't apologetic. They were warning. Not outright, but subtle. The way her brow tensed, the way her lips pressed together. It was a look I'd seen before. Every time I'd stepped out of line. Every time I dared to ask for more than I was given. Next to her, my father didn't move. But he didn't have to. His silence was louder than speech. I could feel it, the same way I used to feel it from across the dinner table when I brought up something too personal. They didn't want this. Not any of it. And I wasn't sure I did either. For a flicker of a moment, a breath held too long, I thought about standing up. I thought about leaving. Just walking out the door. Leaving this house, this room, this weight. Letting them have the story they'd always told themselves, letting them win. I pictured it so clearly, me walking out without a word, starting the car, driving away into the fading light. No confrontation, no scene, just peace. False peace, maybe, but peace. And God, the temptation was strong, because silence had always been the safest choice. I looked down at my hands, at the wallet still heavy in my jacket pocket. I remembered the feel of the cracked leather when my father slid it across the table, the weight of those 3 bills, the unspoken message. It wasn't the money, it was the dismissal, a life reduced to a prop. I shifted in my seat. Clive hadn't moved. He was still waiting. Still holding that paper in front of him like it might catch fire if he breathed wrong. Then, gently he said, "Darian, do you want me to continue?" The words were simple, but they struck me deeper than anything that had come before. He wasn't asking out of procedure. He was giving me the wheel. It was mine to steer or abandon. All eyes turned toward me. Even my brother looked up, for once not with smugness, but curiosity. I didn't speak, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't need to. I nodded once. Clive took that as his answer, and I felt the moment shift. The room didn't erupt. No gasps, no slamming of fists. Just the still, quiet sound of something irreversible beginning. And then Clive adjusted his glasses, gently cleared his throat, and began to read in a tone I hadn't heard from him before. It was slower, intentional, like every word had weight, and he knew it. This portion, he said, was dictated directly by your grandfather to ensure his intentions could not be overridden, misinterpreted, or tampered with. My father sat straighter in his chair. My mother did too, though she folded her hands in her lap like she needed something to hold on to. The light in the room had softened to amber, the sun dipping low, and somewhere in the background I heard the soft click of the hallway lamp turning on. Clive continued, reading from the letter without pause. In the event that my estate is modified in any manner inconsistent with my previously notarized will, and if said changes occur after my mental faculties have been called into question, a safeguard shall be triggered. That word, safeguard, hung in the air like smoke. I saw my father's jaw tighten, and my brother blinked rapidly, the only movement from his side of the room. I have instructed my attorney to execute a clause that transfers temporary oversight of all contested assets to a third-party fiduciary. This includes, but is not limited to land, financial accounts, personal holdings, and the property at 319 Elmont Avenue. I didn't breathe for a second. That was this house, the house we were sitting in, my childhood home. The silence was no longer just awkward. It was active, like the air itself had started to push back against the people in it. My brother broke first. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "He was 92. You expect us to believe he understood legal clauses and countermeasures in that condition? He could barely hold a conversation by the end." Clive didn't flinch. He didn't write this alone. He dictated it to a certified elder law specialist who recorded the statement. It's been reviewed by 2 independent legal firms and notarized twice. It was written 3 months before the alleged changes were made. "You mean the changes Dad made?" I heard myself say, calmly, clearly. My father's head turned toward me slowly, like he couldn't quite believe I'd spoken. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Clive pressed on. "Mr. Ellis, your grandfather, stated that if those changes were challenged, full authority would transfer to the fiduciary until legal clarity could be re-established." "Wait a minute," my brother cut in again, more aggressively now. "You're saying we don't have control over anything anymore? That's insane. This is our family's legacy." Clive looked him dead in the eye. "It was your grandfather's legacy." And he made his wishes very clear. There was a beat, a subtle, almost invisible shift in the atmosphere. I felt it like a tide going out, certainty leaving the room, and something else rushing in to take its place. Control. It wasn't in their hands anymore. Not my father's, not my mother's, not even my brother's, though he still held on to the illusion like a man gripping a rope that had already snapped. I didn't celebrate. There was no triumph in watching people realize their grip was gone. I sat quietly, hands folded on my lap, watching the room, not as an outsider, but not quite as one of them either. My mother looked around like she was searching for an exit that didn't exist. Her eyes flitted from Clive to me, then back to my father. He didn't look at her. His focus was locked forward, jaw stiff, breathing through his nose like he was trying to keep something inside from leaking out. Clive reached into the folder and withdrew another sheet. There are documented timestamps, video and audio files, witnesses. If this safeguard is ignored, a full legal review will be initiated with all supporting material provided. He wasn't threatening. He didn't need to. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a transition. The floor under their feet had shifted, and they didn't know where to stand anymore. I'd felt that way for years, decades even. Now, for the first time, they were feeling it too. And still, I didn't feel victorious. I felt level, steady. Like the truth had finally entered the room and sat down across from all of us. But the tension didn't vanish. It just changed shape. The silence that followed wasn't the stunned kind. It was the calculating kind. That's when my brother leaned forward, voice low, sharp, personal. "If this gets out," he said, not even pretending to mask the threat, "I'll make sure he loses everything else." He said it like a man who'd rehearsed the line. My brother's voice was flat, dead serious, no trace of heat, just ice. "I'll make sure he loses everything else." He didn't flinch, didn't blink. And my father didn't stop him. That silence, that stillness, it said more than any outburst ever could. Mom looked down at her lap, her fingers lightly brushing her wedding ring, not with tenderness, but with hesitation. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Neither of them would. The air had shifted again, sharp and metallic like the moment before a summer storm breaks. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Clive didn't interrupt. Maybe he wanted to see how far they'd go. My brother stood, reached into his leather briefcase with the kind of confidence people mistake for legitimacy. He pulled out a slim folder and tossed it onto the table. "You want receipts?" he said. "Fine. Let's talk about Darian's track record." I didn't move. He opened the folder with a flourish, like this was a courtroom and not the living room of the house our grandfather built with his own hands. The pages he flipped through weren't random. They were curated. "Let's see," he said, voice rising just enough to draw focus. "Missed mortgage payments in 2014, a failed consulting business in Atlanta. Remember that. IRS liens, small, sure, but still. Then there's this email from a former client. She called your behavior erratic. I mean, we're talking about someone who's barely kept himself afloat. And now he wants control of an estate?" He glanced around, daring anyone to challenge him. Mom's lips parted slightly like she might speak, but no words came out. My father didn't even blink. I was used to that. It wasn't new, it was just louder now. I looked at the papers spread out like a crime scene. He'd been digging. Deep. And he didn't yell. He didn't accuse. That was the most dangerous part. He was calm, calculated, framing me in real time with selective truth designed to sound complete. I knew that version of the story. I'd lived under it for years. The old instinct kicked in. Justify, explain. Say it wasn't that simple. Tell them I took that client on pro bono because she couldn't afford legal help. That the lien was settled and the mortgage delays came right after Mom's second surgery, when I moved back to help and lost 2 contracts. But I said none of that. Instead, I breathed. And I remembered my grandfather's voice in the letter, the one moment someone in this family had finally, truly seen me. Clive remained still, waiting. The room tensed like a coiled spring. Then my father finally spoke. "We're not trying to destroy you, son. This is about protecting the family name. Mother followed a second later. We just worry about how things will look, Darian. People talk. This can't become a scandal. Their concern wasn't for me. It was for the facade, for the version of our family they wanted to sell to the world. Clean, controlled, contained. That was when I realized they weren't reacting. They were executing a plan. This wasn't panic. It was strategy. But even strategies have holes. Clive calmly reached forward and tapped one of the pages. Mr. Mitchell, can you confirm the date of this email? My brother looked up. What? Clive pointed again. This email from the client. It's dated March 9th, 2021. But Darian's client log shows he was out of state that entire month, volunteering with Habitat for Humanity in New Mexico. There are signed affidavits, press photos, public posts. My brother hesitated. Just a flicker, but it was there. And this complaint, Clive continued, was formally retracted 2 months later. You left that part out. My brother's mouth opened, then closed. I must have overlooked that detail. Clive's tone didn't change. You overlooked several, including the fact that the failed business you referenced was acquired by a nonprofit. A planned transition, not a collapse. Again, records are public. The silence that followed was thicker than before. I glanced at my father. His jaw moved, just barely, grinding something invisible. Enough, he muttered. But Clive wasn't finished. He picked up the stack of papers and set them aside gently. False statements presented as fact can carry legal consequences, especially when intended to sway the execution of a will. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to request sworn testimony from all parties. That changed everything. My brother sat back, hard. No more smirking. No more curated facts. This was no longer a family argument. It had just crossed into official territory. My mother finally spoke, voice soft, but brittle. We didn't mean for it to get to this point. Yes, you did, I said, my voice steady. You just didn't think I'd stay in the room long enough to watch it happen. Clive adjusted his glasses, slow and precise. Then, almost gently, he said, There is one final document that resolves this matter completely. Clive didn't move right away. He kept his fingers on the leather folder in front of him, the room holding still as if something sacred had been placed on the table. This, he said, was never meant to be opened unless the integrity of this process was compromised. The only sound was the hum of the ceiling fan above us, slow and steady. Night had taken over outside. The windows reflected only our own silhouettes, trapped inside the walls of a house that now felt like it was closing in. No one spoke. Even my brother, who had spent the past hour lobbing grenades, sat locked in place. Eyes narrowed, lips tight. Clive opened the folder with the care of someone handling a last will not of assets, but of conscience. This statement, he said, was handwritten, not typed, not dictated. Your grandfather wrote it 3 weeks before he passed. It was sealed, witnessed, notarized, and specifically marked to be used only if there were attempts to override his original intent. He held up the envelope briefly, letting everyone see the ink, aged, scrawled in a shaky but unmistakable hand. The flap had been opened, but the seal still clung in parts. He slipped out the single page and cleared his throat, and then he began to read. To my family, if you are hearing this, then what I feared has happened. I didn't breathe. I made my decisions with full mind and sound heart. I chose Darian as executor, not out of pity, but because he earned my trust when others were too busy securing their own futures. I watched, in silence, how the rest of you treated him. I heard the conversations you thought I was too weak to understand. I looked at my father. His eyes were fixed on the floor now. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. I rescind any changes made to this estate after August 12th. They were not mine. They do not reflect my will. If this letter is being read, then someone has crossed a line they never had the right to touch. Clive paused. I realized my fists were clenched in my lap. I loved all of you, but love does not mean blindness. Darian, you are the keeper of what I leave behind. Not because you are perfect, but because you never lied to me about who you are. That's all I ever wanted from any of you. The room shattered without a sound. Clive folded the letter and returned it to the folder, but the damage was already done. My father's skin had gone pale. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. My mother just stared at the wall, eyes wide, her chest barely rising with each shallow breath. "And my brother!" he snapped. "No," he barked, shoving back his chair. "This is a setup. You think he wrote that? He could barely hold a pen." He turned to Clive. "You planted this. This is manipulation. This is fraud." Clive didn't flinch. "The handwriting has been verified. The witness is a retired notary and a friend of the family, Margaret Hull. You know her. She was your grandmother's bridge partner for 14 years. My brother's face twisted. "That woman's senile." "She's also a licensed attorney," Clive replied, "and she submitted a statement confirming that your grandfather read every word aloud before sealing it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, collapsing. No one defended my brother now. No allies remained in the room. Clive placed the folder back in his briefcase and locked it with a quiet click. "There's more," he said, "and I'll be filing it per your grandfather's instructions. As of now, the Oversight Board has been notified. Any assets improperly reallocated will be reviewed, and this entire process is now part of a formal inquiry." The power had drained out of the room. The stage they built, the image, the control, the story, was gone. They had been unmasked, not just legally, but morally, and they knew it. I sat still. No celebration, no smile, just still. The tight knot in my chest loosened, and the old familiar weight in my back pocket, the wallet I had brought every time hoping to prove I was worthy of the table, didn't feel so heavy anymore. Clive looked at me gently. "Darian," he said, "would you like to add anything before I conclude?" I shook my head, not in anger, not in pity. Just no. There was nothing left to say. Silence would speak louder than any final word ever could. My hand was already on the doorknob when I heard it. "Darian." It was my father's voice, dry, gravel-thin, not raised, not sharp, just fragile. For a brief second, I froze. I didn't turn. I didn't ask what he wanted to say. Whatever apology might have been forming behind me, it died there. I knew it. And I think he did too. Some words come too late. The click of the door opening wasn't loud, but it felt final. Outside, the air was cooler than I remembered. The porch light hummed behind me as I stepped into the night. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. That house had taken enough from me. I let the door close behind me with a quiet thud and walked straight to the car. Not once did I pause. Not even when the porch light flickered like it was hesitating on their behalf. Weeks passed. The lawyer finalized the documents, one by one. The Oversight Board reviewed the records, timelines, statements. What had once been a mountain of family certainty slowly crumbled into a quiet admission of guilt. No press, no scandal. Just the slow retreat of those who had built their identities on a lie. My brother's name faded from the country club lists first, then from the local charity board. No explanations were given, but none were needed. My parents withdrew into their routines. They didn't call. Neither did I. There was no dramatic confrontation, no screaming finale, just absence. A silence more honest than anything they'd ever spoken to me growing up. One morning, it must have been 3, maybe 4 weeks since I walked out of that house, I found myself at the kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, and that old leather wallet sitting right in front of me. I don't even remember putting it there. I opened it. Same scratches, same wear along the edges. But something caught my eye that I hadn't noticed before. The note. The one my grandfather had slipped inside years ago when he gave it to me. Back then, it was mostly unreadable, water-streaked and faded from age. But now somehow, in the soft morning light, it was clearer. Not perfectly, but enough. Don't let them define you. Not even me. No apology. No flowery language, just that single sentence. It landed in my chest like a key slipping into a long locked door. That wallet. It used to be a burden, something I kept hoping would magically turn into a symbol of acceptance. Now, it was something else entirely. A reminder, not of what I was owed, but of what I never needed in the first place. I thought about who I'd become, not in spite of them, but separately from them. The fights, the silence, the dismissiveness that had hung over every family dinner like a fog. I used to think if I just earned enough, smiled enough, swallowed enough pride, they'd let me in. I'm not waiting at that door anymore. The truth is, I didn't walk away with their approval. I walked away with mine. People ask sometimes, quietly, carefully, if I regret not, trying harder to fix things, if there's a part of me that still hopes the phone might ring one day, and it'll be dad or mom on the other end, ready to talk. I don't wait for that call. I don't fear it either. There's a peace that comes from no longer auditioning for people who were never meant to be your judges. And if you've ever found yourself in that same quiet moment, standing at a threshold, hearing your name said like an afterthought, being offered too little too late, maybe you understand what I'm saying. Maybe you've been there. Or maybe someday you will be. So let me ask you something. Honestly, what would you have done? Would you have stayed? Would you have waited for the apology to arrive fully formed, neatly wrapped, sincere? Or would you have turned the knob, stepped into the night, and walked toward something that felt a little more like freedom? I didn't know everything when I walked out that door, but I knew enough. The sun is just beginning to rise now as I drive along this quiet road. Nothing dramatic. No music swelling, just tires on asphalt, morning light in the rear view, and that wallet resting beside me on the console. Not heavy anymore, not aching, just there. The past acknowledged, but not carried.